This lesson continues the role of South Carolinians in the establishment of their new state government and the national government after the Revolution. In the previous lesson, we learned many things. We continued to learn about the trend of all representation in any assembly in South Carolina or the colonies as a whole would be disproportionately from the Low Country. We learned that South Carolina formed an independent government prior to the first shots of the Revolution in 1774. Of course, this government was the General Committee of 99. We also learned the new term de facto and de jure, which describes the actual role of government. So the de jure government in the Carolinas was the royal governor. However, because no one listened to him and they all listened to the Committee of 99, they were in fact the de facto, or government in fact. We also learned about how a provincial congress was formed, which raised an army, issued currency or money, created a committee to enforce non-importation and non-exportation, and commissioned the writing of a constitution. This constitution would later be approved, and it was known as the Articles of Confederation, which we are going to talk about in this lesson. It was decided that all the states would, or well, they weren't states yet, but the colonies would have their own currency, and this would become a problem later on. But here's an example of some early Carolina currency that was one of the jobs of the Provincial Congress to establish. We, of course, also learned about the Treaty of 96, which was where the backcountry agreed to stay neutral in the fight with Great Britain. However, they later broke the terms of the treaty, and the provincial government sent a force to defeat and silence them. The treaty was signed at 96, and the battle, or the siege of 96, occurred also there. Now, in this lesson, we are going to learn more about South Carolina's first independent government and about the United States' first independent government. South Carolina's first independent government was formed before the first shots of the Revolution. Of course, this government was called the General Committee of 99. It may also be referred to as the provisional government during that time. Well, in 1776, South Carolina's first constitution was written. This would be the 1776 South Carolina Constitution. This will be the first of the state constitutions that we are going to learn about. The South Carolina State Constitution of 1776, one of the main things about it is that this was a temporary constitution. As was said before many times, the colonies had no intention of forming their own government, their own, not government, but their own country. They intended to stay part of Great Britain. All they wanted was the British to give them some representation in Parliament and to end the taxation. Well, the South Carolina State Constitution of 1776, I suppose I should remove the word state because that's really not accurate. Let's call it colonial, because South Carolina was a colony still, theoretically. It was temporary, and it was to serve as the foundation for government until disagreements with England were resolved. You can see no intention of independence in this document. The colonies never intended on independence. So, this, of course, was formed before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, features of this was a two-house legislature. What word have we learned that means a two-house legislature? It starts with a B. Yes, bicameral. The lower house of this was to be elected by the people, and the upper house was to be elected by the lower voting. Either way, as has been shown before, it was going to take agreement of both houses to make policy. In this 1776 Constitution, it was decided that South Carolina would have a president who could also veto laws, which is a feature of our president today. And as usual, as the trend continues, there was to be more low country representation. Well, after the Declaration of Independence was written, there was a second Constitution of Carolina written with a few changes. It's actually 3. And one of the things was the president would now be called the governor. And also, because South Carolina was now, like all the other colonies, intending on splitting and forming a new country, the Church of England was no longer the state church. There was also a third change, as the representation was made a little more equal. So, a little more equal representation, as opposed to being lopsidedly in favor of the low country. A little more. So, this South Carolina Constitution of 1776 would exhibit the following traits. Once again, here's some information from the PowerPoint. South Carolina adopted its first constitution before the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was written by the provincial government, which I was incorrect in the last lesson. And the provincial government was the Committee of 99. The big idea is that this was temporary, and it was to serve as the foundation for government until disagreements with England were resolved. The Constitution was a bicameral legislature, which had a lower house elected by the people and an upper house. The president would be elected by the legislature and could veto laws. The president had the right to veto laws. The low country had more representation than the back country, but a second was written after the signing of the Declaration, which called the president governor. The Church of England was no longer the official church, and representation was slightly more equal. As was said before, the first national government of the 13 colonies who chose to split from England was in Philadelphia for a large period of time. It was also in New York City for a while too. And this government was called the Continental Congress. This would be the first legislature of the U.S. Well, each colony pledged financial obligations to the Continental Congress, and a financial obligation is to pay. And South Carolina was the only one of the 13 colonies that could meet their financial obligations. Now, South Carolina, once again, had a prominent leadership role in the Continental Congress, and a South Carolinian would be elected the first president of the Continental Congress. And this South Carolinian's name was Henry Laurens. Henry Laurens was also a South Carolinian, like Henry Middleton, and he would be president of the Continental Congress. Now we're going to draw a drawing of Henry Laurens, which will be probably awful, but he'll stick out on our page. And why I chose to draw him in such a bad-looking manner, I don't know, but that's what I saw when I looked at him and figured out how to draw him quickly. So we'll give him a nose, and we'll give him, he had a smile. I'll show you a picture of how bad our drawing's going to be. And of course, they all wore those wigs. Henry Laurens had some nice curlers in his wig. So there's a terrible picture of Henry Laurens, and he was from South Carolina, and he was president of the First Continental Congress. So, from South Carolina again, you need to be impressed. Just like Henry Middleton, South Carolina had a big leadership role in the early colonial governments. Now, Henry Laurens would also become quite significant because he negotiated the treaty that ended the war, which, like the treaty that ended the French Indian War, was known as the Treaty of Paris. This is the treaty that ended the Revolution, and Henry Laurens would be one of the negotiators of this treaty. Treaties are usually named after the city in which they take place. Just like the Treaty of 96, which made the back country pledge to be neutral. The Treaty of Paris, which took place in Paris, France, was so named after the city in which it was negotiated. Here's some information. So, South Carolina took an active role in the new national government. South Carolina was the most wealthy of the 13 colonies. And being the most wealthy is probably why South Carolina was the only one of the 13 states to meet the financial obligation that each colony pledged to the Continental Congress. The South Carolinian Henry Laurens would be president of the Continental Congress and also serve on the committee that negotiated the Treaty of Paris. Here is a picture of Henry Laurens, much better than our awful drawing. But this is the gentleman from South Carolina that was president of the First Continental Congress, or not the First Continental Congress, president of the established Continental Congress, and negotiated the Treaty of Paris. Here's another picture of Henry Laurens, who was chosen to be president of the Continental Congress and negotiate the Treaty of Paris. There's the Treaty of Paris. Let's see if you recognize anyone else. I see Henry Laurens right there. Who might this gentleman be? Because boy, was he important in the formation of our country. Yes, that's Benjamin Franklin. And one of the terms of the Treaty of Paris was a change in political boundaries. As you can see, as all wars, we went from being part of the British Empire to being called, you can barely see it, the United States. Now, the first government of the United States would be the Articles of Confederation. This was a government that was carried over from the Revolution before we were even considered the United States. And the Articles of Confederation, the main thing about it is it was weak and did not have the power to rule or govern a new colony. One reason it was weak is that there was one vote per state. And in order for anything to get done, it had to be a unanimous decision, which means every colony had to agree. Also, because the founding fathers, as they're called, feared too much power in a centralized location like a king, they did not give enough power to the national or federal government. And the USA had many problems. One, the new USA had great indebtedness. They owed a lot of money. We're going to talk about this, but a lot of this money was owed to Britain that was part of the Treaty of Paris, that the colonies pay back money that they owe to the English banks. There was also disagreements over many things. Interstate trade, currency, money, taxes, and other states needed a compromise over the western lands. As you can see from that one picture, which I'll show you here now, the new United States included the Ohio Territory, Indiana, and Illinois, which were the living place of many Native Americans. Many people in the Continental Congress needed answers as to what was going to occur with these lands that are inhabited by Native Americans. They needed to know what was going to happen to this land. Was it going to be opened up to settlement for the colonials, or was it going to be in the hands of Native Americans? So by needing a compromise over these lands, a lot of it had to do with the Native American inhabitants and whether it was going to be open for settlement or if it was going to be acknowledged as their own. Now, the Articles of Confederation was very weak, and many people were calling for a change, a new document to strengthen the national government. One of these people was named Charles Pinckney. And Charles Pinckney was also from South Carolina, and he would become a major figure in the formation of the new United States and the writing of a new Constitution, which would give the new United States power to govern itself that the Articles of Confederation did not. So Charles Pinckney, like others, realized that the Articles of Confederation isn't going to work to govern a large country like we live in, and that we need to strengthen the national government. And there would be an event occur that we're going to learn more about in the next lesson in Massachusetts, which would cause this to happen. And what happened is there was a large rebellion up there led by a man named Daniel Shea, called Shea's Rebellion. Shea's Rebellion and the government's inability to put this down would cause a complete scrapping of the Articles of Confederation and a formation of what we have today, the Constitution. So here are some disagreements with the Articles of Confederation. The whole big idea is it was weak and did not give enough power to the federal government. There were disagreements over interstate trade, currency, taxes, and Charles Pinckney chaired a committee of Confederation Congress that recommended amendments to strengthen the national government or to just get rid of it entirely. Here's a picture of Charles Pinckney, that South Carolinian, who would be very influential in the writing of our Constitution, which strengthened the national government. The Backcountry Rebellion in Massachusetts, called Shea's Rebellion, raised the fear of insurrection, and states called for a meeting to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation to strengthen the national government. Here are some pictures of Shea's Rebellion. It was between like 5,000 backcountry Massachusetts farmers and common people between their coastal elite that made their money trading. So Shea's Rebellion was an armed uprising in Massachusetts led by the Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shea, who led 4,000 rebels in an uprising against perceived economic and civil rights injustices. See, the elite, like in South Carolina, in Massachusetts, was on the coast, those who controlled shipping and trade. And the shock of Shea's Rebellion drew retired General George Washington back into public life. The main effect of Shea's Rebellion is this causes a need to redo the Articles of Confederation. This concludes the lesson for today. In the next lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about Shea's Rebellion and also about the way that South Carolina's economics and society continued to develop differently between the backcountry and low country. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.